The following is a video podcast from the Wessels Living History Farm. I want to take you back. I'd like to start back, in your childhood in Iowa. And what do you remember growing up on the farm? What was it like?
I was born in 1914, and for the first 8 years of my life, lived under the grandparental roof. My dad was the second eldest son who was running Granddad's farm. We lived with Granddad and Grandmother, and this was about a 220-acre farm.
That's a pretty big size for that time.
Sure, it was all horsepower and human muscle power.
Yeah. So what were your chores? What did you have to do on the farm?
Well, Granddad had semi-retired. He always worked during the busy season, haying, harvest. But during the rest of the year, for example, he never, during my memory, was involved in milking the cows. He liked to handle the chickens and feeding them and collecting the eggs. And I guess I was kind of his shadow since I was the eldest grandchild.
So you learned how to work with horses and all of that?
Oh, of course. Used to know horses and cattle, milking cows, feeding chickens.
Yeah. Cool.
Separating. The cattle we had were used both for milk production. They were not dairy cattle, but we sold cream, separated the milk. Cream went to farmers' co-op in a little town by the name of Saudi, which was a Norwegian settlement. It's disappeared now. There's nothing left except a Lutheran church. That's the only thing that marks the place where it was.
Yeah. So your background is Norwegian?
Big pardon?
Yeah. What's your ethnic background? What's your family background?
Norwegian.
Norwegian, yeah. So your uncle was a Norwegian bachelor farmer.
Yes.
As Garrison Keillor says.
I think that they were refugees out of the potato famine in Europe also.
Oh, really? Yeah. Interesting. When the Depression hit, you would have just been 20.
I've been 15 years old. I remember all of those days vividly. Granddad was, or I shouldn't say Granddad, Dad, when they built the new buildings, didn't have enough money to build a barn. So they built a long stable, and for the first 6 years would have been, the hay was stacked outside, and you had to carry it in during the winter. It was miserable. I think that depression of the 30s, the scars, the misery that I saw, the banks going broke, the best farmers, and so the damn farmers were foreclosed on. Some of the best farmers. And I saw this, and then what I saw in Minneapolis, which was worse. People, hundreds, yes, I'm sure thousands, asking for nickel to buy bread. That's what I think made me go into international agriculture. Granddad had one of the early crystal radio sets.
What was your favorite radio show, or what was your memory of a radio show that you heard back when you were growing up?
WGN, Chicago. And I got hooked on baseball because you see, as country kids, that's the only sport we had. In winter, it might be ice skating, but most of the rivers and streams would get covered with snow, so there was only a few days when you had clean ice. And wasn't much to do except hunting in winter,
Right.
some fishing, and playing baseball with we had country teams. They got to be pretty good.
Did you play?
Yes.
What'd you play?
I was pretty certain I was going to be, until I was well into college, a second baseman for the Chicago Cubs. That
would
was
be it.
my objective. It looked like I was going to Iowa State teacher. That was my life ambition, to be a high school science teacher and athletic coach. And just a matter of 3 weeks or so before, and the way I got oriented in that direction was that the year after I graduated from high school, I didn't have enough money to, this was 32, to go to college. So I stayed home for a year, and the farm wasn't big enough for both Dad and I. We weren't employed fully. And so I
So you took off a
ran
year.
a trap line in winter, hunted, and these sorts of things. And the Midwest, Cresco, the railroad town where I went to high school, was a hotbed of high school wrestling. And it had had many high school famous wrestlers. Won an Olympic team in 1928, Bob Hess. And so this became my sport. One Friday afternoon in early September, George Champlin came out, the son of the county recorder, and he said, "I missed you. I graduated a year before you started." But I knew, of course, about him. He was a halfback at Minnesota, a little short, speedy. I think he probably weighed 145 pounds, dripping wet. But he could run. He was a scat back. And so he insisted, "Come on, ride along," in his old Model T to Minneapolis. He said, "If you don't like it, you can hitchhike back to go to Iowa State teachers." And I went up, and of course he was an operator besides being a good athlete. He got me a job for my board and one so I could make part of it or pay my rent in 2 days. And so I stayed.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
That changed everything.
Yeah, and he wanted you to come up because of the wrestling. Is that right?
At that time, there was no really decent wrestling in Minnesota. There was a wrestling team, and a wonderful person who was a coach. He was a lawyer, and he did this. He had been a wrestler himself, but not in the modern sense. And so he was a part-time coach. And during freshman years, of course, no one could compete in athletics at that time. So there were tournaments like the Northwest AAU. I competed in that and won 145. But in the universities, because freshmen couldn't compete, they had what they called the all-university athletic
Tournament?
Sort of sports week. All non-varsity. The varsity in the individual sports from others could compete.
Gotcha.
Most of them didn't, but some did.
Yeah.
So I wrestled in the all-university tournament as a freshman, both at 145 and it was a heavyweight, and I won both of them. because I could move fast. After the second term, my grades were excellent, and I asked whether I could transfer. And Hovde, who later became president at the University of Purdue, said, "You can transfer to any college you want to." And so I chose Forestry.
Why? Why Forestry?
I guess because of the outdoor life, hunting and fishing, and I like the woods, the forest. Yeah. And then, of course, this became very much a project that was important, including the dust storms, the shelter belts, soil conservation, all of these programs, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Right. There was a growing demand, and that was part of the reason. But underneath it all, I think I just liked the outdoors.
Yeah.
And so
that's what you chose?
And as a result, there was a shortage of foresters during those times. So I could drop out of school and make enough money to go back and live a little better. I always worked for my board originally, just to show you how things were even in the cities at that time. The first job I got was a waiter at the university coffee shop, and it went broke about 3 or 4 months after it started. Apparently it couldn't pay its milk bills, and they were foreclosed on, and you had to scrounge around and find another place. Yeah. And I finally got established as a waiter in the AOPI sorority house, where Mother Nichols took care of me like I was her son, probably in some ways better than she took care of the girls in the sorority. 2 of us that were classmates in Forestry worked there with her for several years. Halfway through my junior year, I got the first job with the Forest Service in New England. This was under the Northeastern Forest Experiment Station, which was headquartered in New Haven, Connecticut. And I mapped, took the vegetative ground cover, classifying all the plants and the trees. But there was forest only along the streams and rivers, with few exceptions. There were a few woodlots. But mostly this was 20 farms that were reverting. They couldn't pay taxes on them. They were not economic units. And so they were being made into the Hopkins Experimental Forest. And I mapped that, took the inventories, and Dr. Schreiner began making his studies on fast-growing poplar for cereal or for fiber production. And curiously, about 6 years ago, I got a call from Professor Art from Williams College. He said, "You know, the Hopkins Experimental Forest that you mapped and took the inventory on, my class in ecology has been using those notes, and for a couple of years, your old handwriting, and Dickerman, who later joined my group, and they said, 'When did these old fossils die?' And he said, 'No, they're both still alive.'"
One of your other jobs was with the CCC?
CCC. Well, on that survey,
Right.
I had part of those with CCC boys that I lived part of the time on the CCC base, you know.
Right.
The mess and the barracks were run by the Army,
Right.
second lieutenant or first lieutenant. And we people in forestry and sometimes depending on the CCC camp, soil conservation. And then another time when I went back, which was to get some money again, and when I was working on a master's, back to Massachusetts in 1939 to the salvage operation after that big hurricane that flattened everything. Wow. There I had WPA, Works Project, elderly people. And of course, in between the last year of, I had 1 quarter left of school, I worked for the Forest Service out in Idaho in the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, the biggest primitive area without roads in the 48 states at that time. Wow. That's where I learned to know myself.
To know yourself, how do you mean? How do you mean that?
You were all alone. It was up to you. It was fire, of course. And the only time you saw people, it was a bad fire.
Yeah, really. So how long did it take you to get your degrees?
It took me, even dropping out like that and missing several quarters, I got it in 4.25 years.
Wow.
We had quarters there, 3.5 month terms.
Wow.
So I took, when I was there, a heavy schedule.
Yeah. That's great.
And I had a good academic record.
Yeah.
It was funny how I come back into Syria. That last quarter of school, just 2 weeks before final exams, and I had passed my civil service exam, and when I left the Idaho National Forest to come back for that last semester, the superintendent of the National Forest, Idaho, said, "We got a job for you when you finish." So 2 weeks before graduation, this was fall semester, about this time of the year, a little earlier, early December, I noticed on the bulletin board that this Dr. E.C. Stakeman, the famous cereal plant pathologist, especially on the rust that caused epidemics to destroy our wheat and oat crops especially, was giving this lecture on these shifty little enemies that destroy our cereal crops. So I went to hear it, and he was a fascinating old-type professor. He would weave in historical things of different things, and I was fascinated. And as I left that lecture hall, I said, you know, if I ever have a chance to study under this man, I would like to do so. The chance came faster than I had thought, because I was due to go back the middle of January to this job, and had just been married to the girl that I had met. She was in the university, and she had dropped out, and she was working as a proofreader in a publishing company. And then the early days of January, I got a letter from the supervisor of the Idaho National Forest, and he said, "Can you delay your arrival till the 1st of June, because we got some budget problems." And so I started graduate school. Never went back, except that one emergency thing on fire after the hurricane, to get a little more money to help me through graduate school.
And you studied
And
with?
so when I started graduate school, I worked under this same Dr. Stakeman, first on as a forest pathologist, I wanted to study diseases of our forest because I'd seen the chestnut blight being destroyed in New England. Also, it was at the beginning of the period when the Dutch elm disease was killing our elm tree. So I wanted to study forest pathology, diseases of trees, which I did for my master's. And then Stakeman said, look, there's only a couple, 3 jobs that are decent paying in forest pathology. You'll starve to death if you don't get one of those. You better study cereal pathology, diseases of cereals, and take genetics and plant breeding to go with it. And that's what I did for my doctorate.
Okay.
So I came back to agriculture.
Yeah.
By a roundabout way through forestry. But that forestry background has served me very well in understanding best use for our land and water resources. Yes, I was married before I went to DuPont. When I taught the last quarter in school, when I had this job assurance to go to the Forest Service in the 15th of January, and then they said, wait till June.
Right.
So I went to graduate school.
I'm not sure you mentioned your wife's name.
Margaret Gibson.
Did your wife come down to Mexico with you?
Oh, yes. They came. We had, our daughter was born in Wilmington, Jeannie, and she was about a year and a little more than a year. And Margaret was pregnant, and when I left, and so we decided she'd stay until the baby was born. Unfortunately, that baby, Scotty, was born with spina bifida, and that was pretty bad.
Yeah.
And he lived in the hospital all of his life for about a year in Wilmington. And finally she came, and Jeannie came, and our son Bill was born in Mexico. And both of them grew up. Jeannie left to spend 1 year in prep school before university, and she graduated from Kansas University in education. She's a top-notch teacher. And Bill was born there, and he made an omelet out of both languages. We were afraid he would never get into university in either side, so we sent him to Shattuck Academy at Faribault, Minnesota for all 4 years to separate out the 2 languages. And they and their families, and my wife, who's lost her vision, can't travel anymore. She's had some other problems, including stroke. They all live in Dallas. I got my doctorate. I finished my coursework in the fall of 1941. A few months before Pearl Harbor, I joined DuPont Chemical Company, who had decided to expand greatly their agricultural chemicals. And so I had hardly sat down when Pearl Harbor came. And this laboratory was converted to a service laboratory for the armed forces for all kinds of testing of materials that would deteriorate in environmental places like the tropics, and everything from camouflaged paints to all sorts of things. Among other things, I remember vividly one especially. Somebody came in from quartermaster with these cardboard cartons that you put canned food in. And said, look at it, it looks nice, doesn't it? But he said, we've been trying to feed the Marines on Guadalcanal. The Japanese control both the air and the sea during daylight. But at night, with our speed boats, we pitch these things out into the surf and hope they're washed up. But the bonding agent in the bottom opens up in 20 minutes. It was still water-soluble sodium silicate. He said, do something about it. Yesterday, do it yesterday. All kinds of problems like that. And this was the time when the new plastics and working with the chemists, we had pretty good bonding aids where they could float out there as long as the cardboard itself would hold, not the bonding agent.
Right.
There were all kinds of biological problems that came up.
Interesting.
Hard to imagine. There were only 2 laboratories like this, so far as I know at that time. The one in DuPont and the one in Dow. And I think each company got $1 a year from the government. You know, you have to have some kind of a contract. And the services, of course, these were classified as essential to the military. And I stayed there until I was offered the job to go to Mexico in September of 1943.
If you hadn't met Stakeman?
Yeah. The lady, I call her the lady of serendipity. Warpole said it was a prince, but I say it was a princess. And when she smiled, you have to take advantage of that situation because the windows of opportunity close very rapidly.
For more, go to www.livinghistoryfarm.org.